There we go. Okay, so this talk is Authentication and Authorization with Istio and Envoy, which I've also named Utilizing a Service Mesh to Protect Your Services. And as Sean Connery likes to put it, how do I? Don't mess with my services. I've spent an embarrassing amount of time, both one, coming up with that tagline, because every presentation needs a tagline, and two, working on my Sean Connery impersonation, which I probably need to remove from the next time I do this talk. So my name is Nathan Hall. I'm a principal engineer at Clearco. I don't generally spend a lot of time talking about my company, but I started working here and I love what we do. So we are an e-commerce investor, which means, in the past, if you were a startup and you wanted to raise money, you'd either go to the bank and they'd say, sure, we'll give you $50,000. But if you go bankrupt, we're going to take your wife and your firstborn child. Or you go to a venture capitalist and they'll say, sure, we'll give you $50,000, but we're going to take 99% of your company. And we don't do either of those. We're a non-dilutive equity company. We give you $10,000 to $20 million. And we take, if you do well, meaning you're generating revenue, we take a percentage of revenue until you pay us back. The other cool thing about us is we're completely, it's database completely. So if you look at the wider industry, if you look at minorities and women in general, they only raise like 5% of the total funds from venture capitalists, and we do 25 times that. So if you are interested in hearing more about Clearco or what we do, or maybe interested in working with us, let me know. Here are my two connections. I do not have Twitter, which probably might be a good thing now with Elon coming in, but here's my LinkedIn. This is my GitHub. You can see that the name is Dominathan, and Dominathan is actually is my old gamer tag, and it is not to be confused with a BDSM fetish. So about this presentation, what I'm going to start with is talking about the auth problem in general, and then we'll do a quick overview of what a service mesh is and what it does. And then we're going to do a live demo. And I'd like to say that I'm currently 5 for 5 on live demos. And what I mean by that is something has gone wrong in every single one of those 5 demos. So let's try to keep that streak alive. So what's the problem? Well, namely, authentication is hard. And you might say, well, I've added authentication to my Rails app with Devise, or, I've used the bcrypt library and that was easy. And okay, sure, that might be true. I'll give you that. But as your company grows, authentication amongst multiple microservices becomes a lot more important and a lot more tricky than a simple bcrypt module. And the fact of the matter is authorization is a lot harder than authentication. I mean, aside from the latency issues you got when you have a bunch of microservices that need a centralized place to handle your authorization, just the ability to create them properly, and the ability to make sure that they're utilized in all the right spaces and everybody has the right access to them, it's a complex topic. And so what you might notice as your company grows is something like this. So phase 1, you've got 5, 10 customers, maybe one, probably you're the only engineer, and life's good. You've got your first paying customer. It's a simple app. Maybe it's Rails, you're using Devise. Maybe it's Express and you're using crypto or bcrypt, and maybe it's Django, Laravel, who knows? But things are good. They're simple. So phase 2 comes around. You raise a little money, and as you can probably tell by these slides, I am terrible at user design and CSS. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go hire a front-end engineer. And the front-end engineer comes to me and says, Nathan, why don't we split up the back end and the front end? We'll do separate deployments. That way we don't step on each other's toes, but you'll still be in charge of handling the auth. You just, send me, either we'll use sessions or you'll do, JOTs or whatever you want to do, but you handle that. And I say, that sounds great. You know, I can focus more on the back end business logic, and you can handle making everything work nice to the user interactions. So that's phase 2. Not bad. We can handle that. Phase 3, you hit your first bottleneck, and you've hired a few more people, and they say, why don't we split out some of these things that are causing our app to crash? You know, we'll instead of using these giant HTTP requests, we'll just send them into a queue, and we'll spin up Rabbit, and we'll have another separate microservice that you know, talks to Rabbit. And you think, well, I guess that's okay, because you know, the old backend will just, you know, communicate with Rabbit over TLS, and we'll have a, you know, basic auth or something, and the service one could do the same thing. That sounds okay. It's not too complicated. But then phase 4, you got more bottlenecks. You got more services that you have to throw off to Rabbit to handle everything. Phase 5 comes around, and this is when you hire Joe. And Joe likes to remind you at every single conversation you have with him that he used to work at Facebook. And he says, Nathan, you're being stupid. We're going to make a microservice. And this microservice is going to use the back end that you've already had. Like, I'm not going to create my own database, and I'm going to use you for authorization and authentication. And I'm also going to use, but it's going to be a go-between between the front end and the back end. And you say, well, you worked at Facebook, so you probably know what you're talking about. So we're going to do it. And then it keeps building from there. He says, why don't we do micro front ends? And we'll have the shared front end auth library, but we have to deploy that first before we deploy all the other stuff every single time. So it's this weird coupled deployment strategy that I've come up with, but we're going to try it. And also we're going to break out another service called Service 5. And then might as well add in a Kubernetes cluster, because Google uses it. And so you say, sure, that makes sense. So you stand up a Kubernetes cluster, and then pretty soon you get this, and you've created the proverbial big ball of mud. You know, here's you, and here are your developers trying to move this thing along. And here's the engineering manager wondering what he's going to tell the boss. And the boss is out back selling something that you've never even heard of, and you definitely haven't created. Meanwhile, your user's just wondering, why can't he send his tweet? And so that is where the service mesh comes in. So there's 2 things that you really need to know in terms of higher level about what the service mesh is and what it does. And the first one is what you've probably heard of as the sidecar pattern. You know, some people call it the proxy, some people call it the middleware, but it's the sidecar pattern. And basically what it is that if you imagine this gray box as a Kubernetes pod, what the proxy sidecar does is intercepts all traffic. And maybe it does something with it, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's add authentication and authorization. Maybe it's adding circuit breakers or timeouts or retries. Maybe it's adding caching or rate limiting to certain client IDs and client secrets. But what it gives you is the ability to control that through the control plane. And the control plane is where the magic happens. You create these policies, this configuration as code, where there's a centralized place that you can now inject them into your various pods. And so what I mean by that is, if we look at the authentication and authorization policies, these 2 things right here that I'm showing you right now, they are all you have to do in order to have OAuth 2 client credential grant type for your service. And that's what I mean. Istio and Envoy make it very easy for you to do this. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to do a live demo of showing how we would use Istio and Envoy to add authentication and authorization to our service. So this is the book info app. It's the sample app that Istio comes with that we're going to play around with. And if you look at it, kind of like you might see it, you know, a company as it's growing, or a larger company is they're in a bunch of different language. Like for some reason, somebody picked Python to handle the product page, and then somebody said, let's use as much memory as possible and have 3 different Java apps running that do different reviews, but that way we can do some sort of A/B testing on our clients. We got a Ruby app and we got a Node app. And so what we are going to do is we're going to do 3 things. We're going to, 1, add mutual TLS to our services, and I'm going to talk about why. And then 2, we're going to add authentication policies so that only users with the valid JOT can actually access our new service. And then lastly, what we're going to do is add authorization to it so that even if you have a valid JOT, you are only allowed to do the things that your JOT tells you that you can do. So with that, let's try the live demo. So as you can see, this is the Istio landing page, and this is the getting started. I have already downloaded and added Istio CTL to my path. And so what we're going to do is the rest of these. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to install Istio. And I am using Docker Desktop Kubernetes. This works perfectly well with Minikube, and it works perfectly well with any of the cloud providers. So if you want to play along with me, this is the Docker Desktop version. So the first thing is installing Istio, and we're using a specific profile. This profile is the demo profile, and all that means is it comes pre-built with ingress gateway, egress gateway, and a couple other things. I think Certs Manager. You probably will want to look at the different options and configure it yourself when you go in to add this to your cluster. But once that's done, what I love about Istio is how easy they make it to add Kubernetes, add their sidecars to a namespace. And all you have to do is label the namespace with Istio injection enabled. There are other ways to do it, like you can annotate individual pods and deployments if you are so inclined. But since this is a demo, we're going to do it the easy way. So you can see that my namespace is now labeled. So let's turn on the Book Info app. So I'm going to copy this. Notice we got all my pods and services being created. And I can check them out and see that they are being spun up. And if I continue on, that is just looking at services and pods. We can run something to get it internally from the pod, but I'm going to skip this step. What I'm going to do is I am just going to turn on the gateway so that it maps that's not right. So that I can access this from localhost. So you can see that my gateway was created and my virtual service was created. And you can run this to make sure there's no problems, but I don't care to do that. What I want to do is just make sure that this is working. So if we refresh, boom, what a beautiful sight. And as you can see, my CSS skills, watch, I can make this change colors. Red, I know, it's amazing. So what we want to do next is continue on and turn on some of these add-ons. And one of the things that you get with Istio that I really like is some of these observability items. You know, obviously there's Grafana and Prometheus, but Kiali is the one that I think it's swept under the rug. So let's take a look at what we get with Kiali, because we're actually going to use it in a second. The first thing is I need to make sure that we have some traffic generated, and I'm going to run that. And then in another tab, I'm actually going to open up Kiali. So localhost 20.0.0.1. Let's refresh it. And this is, there it goes. So this is what you get out of the box. So one thing, this may be by itself, doesn't look too interesting, and we're going to come back to this. Notice that there's no additional configuration saying that like we have MTLS enabled or authentication authorization enabled. But what you can do is you can actually go see the traffic that shows what your application actually does. And it gives you a very nice view of everything that in terms of ingress egress that comes through your service mesh. And you can actually do cool things like configure version deployments, canary releases, and actually look at traffic as a percentage across these. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about authentication and authorization. So let's start with MTLS. So you might be saying, why do we care about MTLS? And the reason is, you know, back in the day when you controlled the, you know, it was on-prem and you controlled the network, you didn't really have to worry about somebody getting into your system and sniffing the traffic. But that kind of flies out the window when you are in somebody else's data center and somebody else's cloud. Like if you can imagine a disgruntled Amazon employee opening up Wireshark and you've told your partners that you are encrypted at rest and in transit, then if you are using Kubernetes and you do not have MTLS set up, that technically is not true. The good thing about Istio and Envoy is it allows you to do MTLS, like it'll manage the certificates for you. And so you don't have to worry about burdening your teams with setting up, you know, certificates on each side of the transaction. So let's pretend that I am a nefarious user that has gotten into my book info apps cluster, and this for the purpose of this, I'm going to pretend this is the app that they hacked into. It's a sleep pod. It's on a different namespace that does not have Istio. And if you're interested in what this is called Lens K8. It's a great IDE for your Kubernetes clusters. But what we're going to do is we're going to pretend that as a hacker, I got into one of these pods in the cluster, and you know, instead of trying to do some sort of traffic sniffing, what I'm going to show is just that right now, this ratings container pod is completely open to it's unencrypted. So if I say, Carl, we want to get more info on it, we're going to look at the ratings service and the default namespace. We're going to get cluster local. It's running on port 9080. I know that because I wrote it down. And we're going to get a rating. And notice that it comes back perfectly safe. So what I want to do is turn on MTLS for the default namespace. What Istio will do if we turn on, make sure I'm doing the right one. What Istio will do if we turn this on is it will manage the MTLS and the traffic for us. So what I mean by that is if you are a pod in the default namespace and you are sending a request over HTTP, it will upgrade it to HTTPS. So really quickly, I'm going to go over these. The first is we're going to create a peer authentication policy and in the default namespace, and I'm going to say that everybody has to use MTLS strict. So by itself, what that would do is if you're not using HTTPS, it would reject your request. So what you also have to add is a destination rule. A destination rule is on the outbound traffic from a pod or service, and it says egress, if you will, and it says, you know, this one, if something is going to the default anything in the default namespace, handle the TLS policy at Istio mutual, which means Istio will handle the upgrade for us. So let's apply this policy. Not on this one. kubectl apply samples Nathan MTLS policy. And you'll see there are two policies were created. And if I go back to that hacker pod and I run the same command, notice it now says connection reset by peer. And if I try to do, ignore the auth, or if I try to do HTTPS, it'll say invalid certs because I didn't pass in any of the certificates. And if I try to just make it an insecure request, we'll get a broken pipe error. But this is without Istio. If I go back to my default namespace and I go into this pod, it's the same sleep container, but inside the default namespace, and you can see it has the Istio proxy running in front of it. If I go into that container and run the same command with HTTP, as soon as it decides to wake up, this is what I mean. It's always risky to run live demos. All right. If we run this with HTTP, and I say ratings.default.service.cluster.local 9080, ratings 100. Is that the right pod? Ratings, default service, cluster, local 9080. There we go. Well, service unavailable. That's fun. I should, oh, you know what I need to do? I got to restart this deployment. So this didn't go to sleep. And then I restarted, I deleted everything else, but didn't restart this one. And so it's not, I don't think it has the new Istio configurations. See, something goes wrong every time. That's part of the fun. So now we're starting up this new one. And if I go back and I look at Kiali while this happens, notice now that this is here. What is this? MTLS is enabled for the entire namespace. So that means we turned it on. So this is another reason I love Kiali. It's a good way to keep your configurations in check. So now let's use the pod. I'm going to kill this one. And then let's go into this one. Let's try one more time. So we are now in the pod that I just spun up with the new Istio configuration. And hopefully, it has the appropriate. There we go. So we are now rocking and rolling. So as you can see, the sleep pod in the default namespace with Istio can still run HTTP, but it gets upgraded by the proxy that is running with it, but you cannot access MTLS outside of it. So that is great. So now your boss comes to you and says, Nathan, this is great. You've done all this, security stuff, but we're hemorrhaging money. We need to make money. So you need to come up with something that is going to make it so that we can actually keep you employed. And I say, okay, let's think about what we have here. What can we do to make this make money? And what I came up with is this ratings thing right now is currently inaccessible to the outside world. And that's just not fair. Like, everybody should be able to get the ratings of a book. And if I said that, I should be able to, and I'd probably pay for it. So let's start there. What we're going to do is we're going to use Istio to turn on the ability for us to access the ratings endpoint externally. And basically I'm saying here, if somebody hits the /ratings endpoint from our default domain, then route them to the ratings service. You could also think about this like, default.service.cluster.local, but it's smart enough to know that this will work. So let's run that. And we're networking. Book. I'm getting lost. Book info, networking, book info gateway. Okay, configured. Our virtual service is updated. So now if I run this curl command, I get data back. Amazing. So we're getting data back, but what we're not doing is preventing anybody from access this. Like, we need to make money off this endpoint. So how are we going to do that? Well, that is where we're going to use Istio to control authentication and authorization using an IdP of choice. You can use any IdP that you can think of. For the purposes of this demo, I am going to use Keycloak because it's free, it's open source, and it does what we need. And so you can see, this isn't a Keycloak demo, but I have created a realm. You can think of a realm like your own authorization server, and this is the DevOps test realm. And within the DevOps test realm, I've created a client called DevOps Krakow. And what we want is to use OAuth2 client credential grant type in order to get an authorization token back from, or an access token back from Keycloak, and then have Istio and Envoy verify the JOT and do certain things with the JOT depending on what your permissions are. So let's go back and let's look at our new policies that we're going to add. The first policy that we're going to add is the peer authentication policy, or sorry, the request authentication policy. The request authentication policy tells Istio that any app that has this selector rating, so our ratings app that we have now exposed to the world, what I want you to do is I have a set of JWT rules. The first one is the issuer, and that what I'm saying is the issuer that comes in on the token needs to match this string. And the other thing is the JSON web key set URI, hopefully rotating, is here. And what that allows Istio to do is to go out and grab and cache the JSON web key set in order to make sure that the tokens are valid. And as they update and they're invalid because the certs got rotated, it's able to handle that for us. So let's apply this policy. kubectl apply samples. Nathan, and we're going to do the Keycloak. And our request authentication policy is now live, which is great. And so what that means is, let's pretend that we are, well, no pretending anymore. Let's send it a token that does not match the issuer or the JSON web key set that would validate this token. And so this is the default jwt.io token, and you can see our issuer and our the JSON web key set obviously doesn't match. And so if I am to now try to curl, my hands are off center. So we have -I and a -H for header, and we're going to say authorization bearer, and I'm going to paste that token in. Oops. And then we'll go back to the same spot, ratings 100. It tells us we get a 401 unauthorized. The JSON web key state doesn't have any key to match the KD algorithm. That's because it doesn't match. And so what we would like to do then is let's get an author. Well, there's two things I got to do. One is I actually got to expose this this endpoint. So the reason I'm doing this is because I didn't put Keycloak on my Kubernetes cluster. And so in order for this in order for it to access it, I'm just doing this janky in Grok thing, but let's update it. So this should match. Beautiful. Let's reapply our policy with the updated JSON web key set. And let's run our token again. And it still is not working, which is what we would expect. But what we do want is to get a token from Keycloak. So this is our client ID, DevOps-Krakow. Here's our client secret. And what we want to do with that is we actually want to generate a token. So I'm basically going to, let's see, curl, I think I had a DACX push up. Okay, here we go. So this is the endpoint that we would use to get the token. And we know that because if we go back and look at our settings for the DevOps Krakow, it'll show us that one of the endpoints for this, I forget exactly where it is, but it'll tell us that this is where we would see this. And so what we want from the OpenID configuration is we want the JSON web key set URI, which is going to be this. But we also know that the token endpoint is this. So let's go back. I'm just getting this locally. So I'm saying I want the grant type to be client credentials. The client secret needs to match the client secret that I just grabbed. Just make sure it's the right one. B2X. There we go. Yep, this is the right one. And DevOps Krakow. So if I do this, I should get an authorization token back. And lo and behold, here an access token. Here it is. If we go and we plug that into our jwt.io just to decrypt it, it's a lot more stuff in here. But the main important ones are the issuer and the sub, which is generally the equivalent of a client ID. And this is important for Istio and Envoy. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use this token instead of the invalid one we sent just a minute ago. So why don't I just do curl-i-h authorization bearer, copy paste, and then HTTP local host 80 ratings 100. And this should work. Notice I get back my ratings. But what happens if I just say, actually, I don't want to pass in a token. I just want to get ratings. So if I do that, it's still open. And the reason for that is the request authentication policy, all it does is say, if a JOT comes in, it must conform to this rule, and it's, you know, a list technically, so you could have multiple rules if you wanted. But if you don't pass anything in, that's fine. And so what that leads us to is the authorization policy. So if we go look at the authorization policy, there's three things in the authorization policy that you need to know. The first one, and they're all in the rules. The first one is the from. The from says this token that's coming in, who owns it? And so there's two things that you can do. One, well, there's a lot more than two, but there's two that I'm going to show. One is you can set up a service account with your internal pods and deployments that allows Istio to know that any request coming from the book info reviews should be able to come through. So that's one. The other from is to get from the issuer. So if we look back at that token that I just showed, the ISS matches this. So that's what from does. It says anything that comes from these resources should be able to access. The next is the to. So if the from is valid, the to is saying where can they go? So if you just said from, basically all Istio is going to do is say, okay, this is a valid token. It can do whatever it wants. But you can be a lot more restrictive and say the book info app, the book info reviews app should only be allowed to do get methods. You can also say they should only be able to go to certain routes. Like, so a lot of times you'll see that the another good example is you don't have a from. You're saying anybody can visit the operation that is the path of like health. Like anybody should be able to visit that, if you have some sort of health checks running, you shouldn't close it off. So that's another good example. So the to says, what can they do? The from says who they are. And then let's run this real quick and I'll show you what, I'm going to comment this one out. So the first thing I'm going to do is run this. How much time I got? Okay. I'm going to run this. And what we're going to do is just make it so that only our internal reviews app can access the only the internal reviews app can access our cluster. So if I refresh the book info app, we should still see our reviews. So that means that's working. But if I run this, it takes a while. Oh yeah, I didn't turn it off to do that. So that shows that we can access these. The next thing is to allow tokens. And so if I allow tokens, so we talked about this, the request principal. The first part is the ISS and the JWT. So we looked at that. The second one is the sub. So you can be very specific and say this, only this sub is allowed, or is it there? Only this sub is allowed to do it. If I put star, that means anybody with this issuer can do the following things. And for our purposes, we're going to say, I got to apply it. For our purposes, we're going to say they can do any sort of get operation. So kubectl apply, same thing, reconfigured. So now I shouldn't be able to hit it externally without a token. Notice it says 403, RBAC access denied. That is what we were expecting. But this guy should still be able to hit it because that token matches. But now notice that we got a 401 unauthorized because it expired, which makes sense because we had an expiration time of 300 seconds and that time is now passed. So the very last thing for time that I'm going to show is, let's do the last piece that is important for these policies, and it's the when. And this is where the nuts and this is the most bang for the buck that you get. Anything inside your JOT that you create can then be used to further restrict who can do what. And so in this example, I'm saying inside the claims, so the claims are, any one of these keys. If the client ID matches DevOps Krakow, then we want to pass them through. And just to show it working, I'm going to say, I'm going to give it a different value. And what I want to do is run it so that that token, that I have to get another one. This token isn't going to work because the claims don't match what it's expecting. And so if I run this again with this new token, I'm going to get a 403. I should have anyway. Let me see. Did I save it? Let's look at this token. When the client ID, yeah. There we go. Sometimes it takes it a while for it to update, but it's generally pretty quick. And I get a 403 now. But if I were to change it back to DevOps Krakow, save it, update it, and I run it again, I should be able eventually to, there we go. I'm able to get it. So you can think about that like as you add specific key value pairs to your authorization model, you can further restrict where they go, what routes they can hit. You can even, you can make requests to your database to pull certain other, you can think like this user has access to these 3 categories. You can pull that information back, attach it, and have Istio handle the rest. So this has been great for me as we continue to expand our microservice offering capabilities to really take away some of the complexity of having to manage it yourself. So with that in mind, that is the end of the presentation. And, the last thing is open it up for questions.